Hello and welcome to Warrior Maven, the Center for Military Modernization. Very significant conversation today in light of the nuclear threat posed by Putin and the Russian military. Sure enough, the forces were not only put on alert, but there have been even more recent threats, of course, along with the use of hypersonic weapons at war, the first time ever. Here to talk about this is a very gifted expert, Mr. Peter Huessy. He is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council, and also has his own consultancy, GeoStrategic Analysis. Mr. Huessy, thank you so much for your expertise.
Thank you, Chris, for inviting me. It's an honor to talk with you today.
Well, you've been one of the one of the leading thinkers of this kind of stuff for quite some time. And I'm interested in just the simple question of how realistic is it? Well, will Putin fire a tactical nuclear weapon?
Right. Well, let's start at the beginning, and that is 1997, 98, 99, when Putin was Secretary of the National Security Council in Russia and unilaterally decided to change previous Soviet and currently Russian strategic nuclear doctrine. And what he invented was what General Hyten, the former vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs, said was escalate to win, meaning even before a conventional aggression occurs by Russia, he would threaten the use of small, limited number of nuclear weapons, probably in the regional level, small tactical nukes. He threatened them to such a point where it said the adversaries that he's fighting would stand down and not fight. So as Sun Tzu said, the acme of warfare is to get the other guy not to fight. And that is what Putin did. And when he became president of the country, he then put into place a modernization effort starting in around 2000, a modernization effort, which is now 90% complete. And they have 25 currently in progress or built nuclear weapon systems, both conventional and, both strategic and regional. And the worry is that he would use a limited number of weapons and threaten to use them to get us to stand down. That is what he has brought to the nuclear table, which is what is so worrisome.
Roger that, certainly getting a whole lot of attention. There has been this question of would there be a measure for measure tactical nuclear kind of attack of some kind based on the premise that there might not be a catastrophic response. But the threat situation globally has been changing quickly, and you've been tracking this for quite some time. It was Admiral Richard, the commander of STRATCOM, recently told the Senate Armed Services Committee, this is a three-peer world. This is not just two major nuclear powers, but three. We have a different world today.
He is very right. I have to the man is very, very right and very, very courageous. He has basically said America has always had one peer competitor in terms of conventional forces in the Soviet Union, and they were nuclear armed. But now we have two. We have two peer competitors, China and Russia, both nuclear armed, which is unprecedented, plus the fact that everywhere from cyber warfare, space warfare, conventional and nuclear, it's all one continuum, and you don't know what the bad guy is going to use at any particular time. Our response or capability is we have tactical nuclear weapons, about less than 200 in Europe. They're aboard tactical airplanes, not bombers. They're theater fighter planes, and they would take a certain period of time to get to Russia if we targeted something like that. Russia, on the other hand, has 2,000, not 200, but a minimum of 2,000 such weapons, both air, sea, and land. And they can come at us from Kaliningrad, that little enclave between Poland and the Baltics, and they can get to Warsaw, can get to Kiev in a matter of single-digit minutes, is what I understand, in terms of a low-flying cruise missile, which could be nuclear-armed or conventional armed. So we don't have the capability to respond. And let me make a very important point here. A couple arms control groups have come out and said, even if Putin uses nuclear weapons, we should not respond in kind. Let me emphasize that. Bruce Blair, the founder of Global Zero, who passed away a year or so ago, said in testimony before the House Armed Services Committee, even if Russia uses nuclear weapons against the United States, we should not respond with nuclear weapons. What that does is it takes your nuclear deterrent off the table.
Right.
And I doubt that's going to persuade Mr. Putin not to use nuclear weapons. As Victor Hansen points out, by taking military capability off the table up front, which our administration did, saying we're not going to get involved militarily, we're not going to send conventional forces, and then he took weapons off the table and said, well, we'll go to sanctions. It gave the initiative to Mr. Putin to use military force as he saw fit, which is really, really dangerous. And this idea, again, the founder of Plowshares and Joe Cirincione said today in an essay, we should get a group of elders together who should emphasize the taboo against using nuclear weapons. Well, I'm all for elders getting together and talking about the taboo about using nuclear weapons. But to be honest with you, I don't think that will have a hill of beans difference with respect to Mr. Putin. The only thing he would recognize and understand is deterrence. And deterrence requires a formidable nuclear capability and conventional capability to basically tell Mr. Putin, you're not getting any advantage by using nuclear weapons, period.
Sure, well, you raise a compelling point, and the question has been to some extent, could Putin hold the world hostage with this nuclear threat? And should that even be possible? It calls to mind something I know you've been tracking for several years as well, 2018 Nuclear Posture Review. I remember former Secretary Mattis speaking on the Hill, telling members of Congress, look, we are asking for low-yield nuclear weapons, not because we want or intend to use them, but to bring Russia back to the negotiating table, to let those in power who have decision-making authority have the widest possible contingency of deterrence options available to them. And of course, that review called for a submarine-launched nuclear-armed cruise missile and lower-yield variant of the Trident II D5, as well as other potential avenues of adding options to commanders. What's your sense of that?
Well, the D5 low-yield weapon we have deployed. The numbers are probably in the low single digits, maybe a dozen. I don't know what the number is actually, but it is deployed. And this administration was persuaded not to get rid of it. There is money, research and development money for the cruise missile for the Navy, low yield to be launched either from surface ships or submarines. That's not built yet. It was in our inventory 2 administrations back under Mr. Obama, but he took it out and deleted it, similar to what George Bush 41 did at the end of the Cold War, where we got rid of all our tactical nuclear weapons aboard all our ships, all our Army battlefield weapons in Europe. And we had thousands, as did the Soviets, and we just got rid of them. And so we're basically down at least 10 to 1. Russia has at least 2,000 of these tactical nuclear weapons. And as I said, Mark Schneider and Steve Blank, 2 Russian experts, as well as 3 Chinese experts I heard from just the other day at Hudson, Gordon Chang, Brad Thayer, and Rick Fisher, all 5 of these people recommended that we do a triad of regional theater systems, cruise missiles for the Navy. We have airplanes, and then INF treaty is gone, so we can do missiles with that range, and we can make them nuclear armed, similar to what we deployed under President Reagan, the Pershings and Glickums. That, let me tell you something, would get Russia's attention, and also, in my view, would deter them from even breaking the threshold of nuclear weapons. I agree with my friend Michael Crapon. We don't agree on much, but he's head of the Stimson Center, and he talked about his view is not no first use, but no use. We should persuade through deterrence any adversary, don't even think of using nuclear weapons at any level or any scale, whether escalate to win or not. And that is what, you can't do that by diplomatic persuasion. You have to have a deterrent, plus you have to have the policy that says you can't gain anything by going that way. And missile defense comes in big time here, particularly space-based defenses. And as you pointed out, a missile from Kaliningrad can get to the Ukraine or Poland in minutes, and it can be hypersonic type speed. If they're the Chinese, for example, they put it in mid orbit and launch it not like an ICBM, an upside down U, but something that comes across the terrain of the earth and very difficult to find and track, and therefore very difficult to shoot down. But again, I don't see any alternative, Chris, except for deterrence.
Well, you point to that
70 years. Go ahead.
No, roger that. You point to the fundamental paradox of strategic deterrence. No one wants global annihilation, but it's precisely the prospect of that kind of scenario that prevents it from ever happening. I recall a very famous thinker, Mr. Brody, who was talked to me about Air Force 3-star in charge of the GBST, the new ICBM program, talked about Mr. Brody from decades ago in the dawn of the nuclear era, essentially making the point there's a paradox involved here. It's the idea of using a weapon, perhaps even for the first time in history, engineering a weapon to never use it. And so that's kind of the fundamental contradiction that this entire premise is based upon. And some are potentially concerned about the need to emphasize that right now.
Yeah, Paul Nitze was a mentor of mine during the Reagan administration, and he often told me he wants to give the Russians basically two choices. Don't use nuclear weapons, or you can initiate Armageddon. Said anything you do may go all the way, and any limited strike we can deal with missile defense, we can respond in kind. So there's no advantage to ever crossing the nuclear threshold.
Well, you were talking about the importance of a posture. Sure enough, there was Admiral Richard was asked about a declaration policy on the part of the U.S. He didn't make a specific position per se, but recommended and has in recent publications talked a lot about the importance of not taking anything off the table. As you point out, if you take a position that there might not be any nuclear response, is it in effect a green light?
Well, as I said, what has been now proposed by these arms control groups is if the Russians use nuclear weapons, we should never not respond with nuclear weapons. I'm not sure what they would like us to respond to or with. The problem is that doesn't persuade Mr. Putin. In fact, if anything, it would embolden him. As Admiral Richard has pointed out, and other military officers have pointed out, once you take something off the table, you may feel good about it. It may make you feel moral and may make you ethical. But the problem is you got other guy on the other side of the world who doesn't think like you, who doesn't have the same values. And I have to be very honest, Mr. Putin is just simply evil. Totalitarian people kill millions of their own people to stay in power, whether it's Mao Zedong, Stalin, Hitler, and Putin hasn't yet killed millions, but that's what totalitarians basically say. We don't care how many people we kill of our own people to stay in power. And that is the danger of someone like Mr. Putin, who has been held in relative check, except for he went into Georgia, went into Moldova, went into Ukraine. Remember, he did this, 2008 and 2014, long before Mr. Trump came into power, long before the current situation. He's already, and then people like Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, invaded Iran. The Falklands is another example. I think Churchill pointed out that if you start changing borders with military force, you're going to get war. You're certainly not going to get peace. And the whole point of, we don't like some countries, there's some bad guys in them, but they stay within their own borders. That's worthwhile. Remember, Catherine the Great was asked once about how does she protect Russian borders? And she said, well, expand them.
Sure enough.
Which is an interesting point of view of how do you have secure borders? Well, you just keep expanding them.
I recall talking to a Navy official like you, tracking the history of the Columbia-class maturation, the Ohio-class ballistic missile submarines. And one of the things this official said was the whole point of these kinds of weaponry is to send a clear message, don't even think about it. Exactly. So does that message need to be reiterated? Someone needs to say, and I saw an essay written about this just yesterday, someone saying, let's send a reminder. We have these ballistic missile submarines quietly patrolling the earth, well positioned to essentially annihilate any user of nuclear weapons.
Cliff May, the head of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, wrote exactly that piece and said, we have to remind people we have a deterrent for a reason. And former President Trump pointed that out as well, saying, yes, Russia's a nuclear power, but so are we. And the whole point was to say, our nuclear power checkmates your nuclear power. I think, as you know, when General Herensack said we went on a holiday after the end of the Cold War, we forgot to think about these issues. Plus, we stopped building. Remember, we stopped the Trident program in 1992. We stopped Peacekeeper at the same time. And then B-2 we killed in 1997. All three legs of our triad we stopped building in the 1990s under the assumption there was the end of history. The liberal international order was going to basically dominate the world, and military capability was less needed than previously by a lot. And we ended up basically making a huge mistake. As General Harensack said, we went on a holiday from history as well as an acquisition procurement holiday. And now we're doing everything simultaneously together, rebuilding our entire triad and the nuclear command and control, NC3, and the warheads. And we're doing it simultaneously, which is what happens when you delay and kick the can down the road. You eventually end up running out of road. Even though we're doing all this together, the cost, believe it or not, 1/3 of the cost you see in the newspaper is for modernization. If we did nothing, we'd have to spend two of every $3 just maintaining and operating the old stuff.
Sure. Well, that's incredibly important. I mean, sure enough, for many years, there's been this ongoing debate about the need to modernize, sustain the Minuteman IIIs, and of course, introduce the GBSD, new ICBM. And sure enough, that kind of discussion has rapidly taken on even new urgency. And that's not to say it wasn't previously urgent as well. And so is there a bit of a gap or an impasse here in the sense that GBSD is projected to be ready end of the 2020s, 28, 29. The Columbia class is expected to have its first patrols, I want to say as late as 2031 or so.
That's
now,
right.
The B-21 is moving along, is about to take flight, and may potentially be ready in just the next couple of years. And then I have to think of the B-61 Mod 12, which takes all these otherwise disparate variants of the airdrop nuclear bomb, puts them into one. So you have earth penetrating, you have bunker buster, you have different kinds of area detonations to create a lower yield effect. The idea of variable yield is also very significant, gaining a lot of traction within Air Force thinking. The idea of giving pilots and commanders options. So with all that being said, sure enough, Admiral Richard made the point, yes, I'm achieving deterrence, but it's happening with 60s, 70s, and 80s equipment. We have got to really double down on this acceleration of modernization.
Yeah, we don't have any room to spare. We're up against, basically, we have to go. And I must say this, all the commanders that I've spoken with say our systems are on time, on budget, and under cost. And the thing about GBSD, which is remarkable, if it works the way I think it's going to work, we'll save close to 2/3 the operations costs, which you're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars a year. And remember, the numbers you hear about, that's going to last for 55 years. The subs are going to last, I think, for at least 70 years. And given the fact that B-52 is going to be 100 years old when it's all said and done in its final chapter in that plane's history, I wouldn't be surprised the B-21 lasts certainly half a century or more, depends on how you can add technology to it. But we're getting basically for not 1.2 trillion. That's not the cost. The cost is between $400 and $450 billion over 30 years for the new systems. That's over 55 years at a minimum. So when you do that math, you're talking about, we're talking about what, $9 billion a year. We spend $11.5 billion a year going to the movies.
Sure.
Okay. I'm talking about getting in the car and driving to the movies. I'm not talking about watching on TV. So when you look at the cost of doing this is relatively, it's between 3 and 4% of the nuclear capability added to the 3 to 4% of operations and maintenance. So it's a relatively modest amount of money. Looks big when you stretch it out for 40 years, as some of the arms controllers do, but it's eminently affordable given the literally trillions of dollars we have spent on COVID. And we spend, I think, the war on poverty since 1966, means tested poverty programs, according to the Mercator Center, we have spent $27 trillion. Well, not quite our national debt, but close.
Well, certainly,
and poverty rate is still 14 to 15%. Wow. And in a bad year, and it's about, I think Trump got it down to 10.5, which was the lowest it's ever been. But again, that poverty is pervasive. Even though we have spent this money, Lyndon Johnson said, remember, the war on poverty was not just to pay people to keep them, alive, but to get rid of poverty itself, which we haven't done. And yet I see very little comment about, you spent $27 trillion trying to get rid of poverty and it's still stuck with us. Okay.
You know, one of the things that comes to mind is the significance of this issue. I mean, we're talking about nothing less than the potential survival of the globe. So we
Yes,
could talk for hours, to be sure. One last question for you, which is, I
yes.
did read an Air Force commander. In fact, I saw an interview raising concern about a possible missile gap, which is why you see so much ongoing modernization of the Minuteman IIIs and continued test firings to send that message, hey, we have a viable deterrent here. We have
Yes.
something operational. Will there be a gap as Minutemen, already decades arguably bonded shelf life, starts to sunset, if you will, before the GBSD can actually be here in sufficient numbers?
Minuteman is an extraordinarily capable missile that is given mini sleps twice, and it's meant to last through 2035. And I think it will. When I talk to the Minuteman modernization and sustainment people, I'm amazed at the creative ways they have worked to keep that missile viable, credible, and on alert. But your question of a gap, if China's 350 silos are filled with DF-41s, those are 10 warhead missiles. Let's just assume they put 5 warheads on them. You can do the math. That's 1,800 new warheads right there. Add those to the Russians, and we then have basically a 2-to-1 advantage of Russia and China versus the United States. Now, you have to ask the question, do numbers matter? Every arms control agreement we ever signed with Russia, we both have the same number we're allowed, right? Well, the numbers apparently do matter. So what is the 2-to-1 advantage of Russia and China versus the United States? And believe it or not, it would take us 4 years for us to build up. We could double the number we currently have. Instead of 1,500, we go to 3,000, which would take us 4 years. You can't do an ICBM takes, we can do 3 missiles per month per wing. We have 3 wings. So, and you can add some to the subs, but bombers are already maxed out. Russia and China could easily not have 3,000 total, but 6,000 or 7,000. So the question in my mind is the gap in this case is very real. We have to monitor it. The problem is, as you know, China is not very transparent. As Admiral Richard said, they're going to go up to at least 1,000 warheads from 300 by the end of this decade. He thinks it might be more, depending on what they do with those silos. He recently, I think, said they have built over 300, I think 350 new silos, and they haven't made any, they're not trying to hide them. So my thing is, Chris, I think we're facing a very significant missile gap, but it's all based on what they decide to do, and they're not under restraint. China is under no restraints, no arms control deal. And as I said, Mark Schneider in his test speech to Hudson on the 18th of March said, Russia has 25 nuclear weapon systems under development or being deployed. Now, 25. That means their capability of expanding is huge.
And then there's the question, as Richard pointed out over the summer at a missile defense conference, of China building actual silos on mainland China. And that's in addition to the road mobile ICBMs, many of which are armed, according to a congressional report, with multiple re-entry vehicles. So there is, as you say, this bolt out of the blue mass element of the seriousness of the threat.
I agree. I mean, China has not been very explicit about what their strategy is, but more and more they're talking about escalate to win vis-a-vis Taiwan, where they threaten the use of nuclear weapons against the United States in the region. Remember, they just said recently that if Japan came to the defense of Taiwan, they would strike Japan with nuclear weapons over and over again until, get what? Until for the second time they surrender.
Did they really? Was that the wording that was
to World War II? And that was explicit. It wasn't even couched in nice diplomatic words. That I'm quoting them directly. Okay,
well,
they will hit them with nuclear weapons until they surrender for the second time.
Mr. Peter Huessy, I want to thank you for your expertise. Unfortunately, these very serious issues are front and center, getting a lot of attention, needed attention right now, as the world is increasingly becoming more dangerous by the day these days. Thank you for joining us, the Center and Warrior Maven. I'll talk to you again. Thanks for your expertise.
Thank you, Chris, very much. Deeply appreciated. Take care.